All right. Well, that just put a little fire under my feet, I guess you could say. It just pepped me up. That is just fantastic news. And on top of everything else, I'm excited to be back. So let's jump into it. We are on our 14th class since we began. And I believe this is about 16 weeks into it. But class number 14, and we're going to be talking about now premillennialism. That sounds like a big word, premillennialism, but it's really not too bad. What does pre mean? Yeah, before. And what do you think of when you think of millennial or millennium? 1,000, yeah. Something to do with 1,000. And so we're talking about a mindset, the ism there. We're talking about a belief, a theory about the millennial reign of Christ, the 1,000-year reign from the book of Revelation, about chapter 20 of that book. And so there are many who take a very literal belief as to what the Bible means when Jesus says that He'll reign for 1,000 years. And so basically, premillennialism is what's become the most popular, the most widespread, really just a huge, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not coming to me. Anyways, it's just a big fiasco. That's not the word I'm looking for, but it's a, what's that? Yeah, it is. It really is. But everybody's going into this, buying into this belief that Christ is going to come again and reign for 1,000 years. Now, if you look at your sheets, there's a couple of, I would say, 3 major millennial theories. And there's many others. And there's even really subcategories of the premillennial theories. But we're just going to talk about some of the major ones. First of all, there is a theory called postmillennialism. Postmillennialism. And basically, the difference between this and premillennialism, they do believe in a literal 1,000-year period, but they believe that the 1,000-year period is going to bring pretty much everyone, especially the Jews, into the church. More and more are going to be saved as that 1,000 years continues on. And then at least the part that they have right is that when Christ comes, it will be His second coming, and that will reign or usher in the judgment day. Amillennialism is the belief that the 1,000-year reign is not literal, that it's figurative, and that it describes the last days, the Christian age. Okay, it's unfortunate that it's amillennial. What does the prefix a do to a word, to a noun? Yeah, it means not, right? Anti-a, it doesn't. And so basically the word means not a millennium, but it's not literally one, but there is a 1,000-year period, not literally 1,000 years, but figuratively, and that 1,000 years figuratively represents the Christian age, the last days. But that, of course, is the closest of what we would believe. We certainly wouldn't buy into postmillennialism or premillennialism. Again, this is the most popular one. Basically, premillennialism is the idea that Christ was rejected. That's where it all begins, and where we're going to begin in just a moment. Christ came to this earth, and He had 2 goals in mind, 2 major goals. One was to die on the cross. The other was to set up His earthly kingdom. However, Christ failed to do one of the 2. He failed to set up His earthly kingdom because His own rejected Him. Okay? In this theory, those that believe in premillennialism believe Matthew 24, we're going to look at that tonight, are the signs that represent when this will happen. Basically, Christ will come again, and He will rapture those who are His, the saints, up in the clouds with Him. That's what they believe 1 Thessalonians 4 is talking about. Christ comes again, not a second coming, even though it literally is, but not the second coming we're aware of, not Judgment Day just yet. He comes back, and He brings the saints with Him, and there's a 7-year period of tribulation. Okay? Basically, in that 7 years, they divide it into 2 segments, 2 3-half periods. And those that are on earth, the wicked ones, right, are going to be persecuted. They're going to go through hardships. Many of them are going to die. And at the end of that 7 years marks the Battle of Armageddon, if you've ever heard that before. There's going to be a great war that takes place, a great battle. And that's when Christ will come down to earth, they believe, and reign on earth with His saints. He'll bring them back with Him, and they'll reign together for 1,000 literal years. And at the end of that period, judgment will take place, only, though, for the wicked. That is the basic overview of premillennialism. We're going to slow down, though, and break that down piece by piece, at least the beginning of it tonight. Look at your sheet there. The three major millennial theories include post-millennialism, amillennialism, and premillennialism. And of course, premillennialism, letter A there, is the most common and widespread theory today. Now, it is identified by two things that we've already mentioned, the 1,000-year reign and the rapture. Okay? I want to mention this about the rapture before we move on. The concept of a rapture is not unbiblical. Okay? The concept of being caught up in the clouds to meet Jesus in the air. Is that true? Yes. In that sense, we'll be raptured to meet Him. However, the way that they use the word rapture has really kind of ruined it. If somebody says to you, do you believe in the rapture? You can't really say yes, because they don't simply mean the Lord's going to bring His own in the air. It's associated with this 1,000-year reign. I've never heard someone say, do you believe in the rapture, and not be talking about premillennialism. That's just how it's been used. And it's not a biblical term anyways. The Bible doesn't use that term. And so there's no sense in us using it anyways. But that's what we mean when we say the word rapture. All right, let's go to Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53. And again, in this series of sowing the seed, evangelism, obviously this comes way, way, way down the road. Notice we're 14 weeks in before we get to this, because this is not something you teach, when you're trying to convert someone. But, once someone obeys the gospel, you're continuing to help them grow. So way down the line, eventually, you're probably going to have to address this. Just about anybody in the denominational world, not all of them, but many of them that you come in contact with, are going to believe in all or some of this premillennial theory. It's just that popular. Anybody ever heard of the Left Behind series? Right, that's what that is. That's premillennialism, the rapture. In fact, I think there was a movie that came out recently with Nicolas Cage, wasn't it? Where they're taken out of the plane and this. I saw it advertised. But anyways, it's a very, very popular belief. That's what premillennialism is. And so Isaiah chapter 53. This is a chart. You can kind of see that. We're going to build on this chart throughout this study, and probably into next week as well. But we're starting with Christ is rejected. Somebody read Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 3. This is where premillennialism begins.
Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not.
Excellent. So this is a prophecy about who? Jesus Christ, of course. Christ is not going to be a man that is the most handsome among men. Is not going to be something special about the way that he looks. He's going to be the very Son of God. And in verse 3 it says that he would be despised and what? Rejected. Rejected. The blank there, the Jews rejected Christ, number 2, and it was prophesied that he would be rejected. Again, the belief is that this was a mistake. They messed up. They didn't know this was going to happen, apparently, or they knew it and they just let it happen anyways. But according to this theory, Jesus failed because he was rejected. However, I want you to notice it was prophesied from the beginning that would take place. Look at John chapter 12. Turn over to John 12, and we see this reiterated as it's fulfilled in the New Testament. John, especially of the four Gospels, talks a lot about the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, in particular Messianic prophecy. John chapter 12, verse 37 and 38. But though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him, that the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? Okay, true or false, when Jesus came to this earth, he was rejected by men. True, he was. Absolutely. He was rejected by his own, right? Now let me ask you this, true or false, every Jew rejected Christ? False. Not every Jew did. In fact, I find John 6 and verse 15 very interesting in this particular study. John 6 and verse 15. Somebody read that for us. Let her be there. The answer, of course, is false. Not everyone did. And here's how we know that. Just one example. John 6 and verse 15.
Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone.
Very good. They were going to, by force, make him their what? King. There were some who wanted him to be the king. In fact, what was the group? What was the name, the identification, the term used for that group who really wanted for Jesus to become that earthly king? What did they call those men? One of them was an apostle. Zealots. Exactly, the zealots. The zealots believed and wanted him to become that earthly king. And even most of the apostles had in their mind that he was going to be an earthly king. And they thought about, remember even in Acts 1 and 2 when they say, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Right? When he talks about the kingdom, they just didn't get it there for some time. And so some wanted the blank there to make him a king on earth. All right? Yes, he was rejected, but he was prophesied that he would be. That was part of the way it was going to work. But not everybody rejected him. Here's the point. Could Christ have become an earthly king when he was here and set up an earthly kingdom in the sense that they're thinking if he had wanted to? Absolutely. Would some have followed him? Absolutely. Christ did not fail to set up the kingdom. That's not at all what happened. And we know that. Let's talk about the kingdom. The kingdom of Christ. The rejection supposedly caused Jesus, of course, to fail in setting up the kingdom. Now, I want to start with what I would call the three stages of the kingdom. All right? The kingdom, if you will, God's people began in the very beginning, almost anyways, once at least you get into the book of Exodus. The kingdom, or in particular 1 Samuel, let's more technically, Israel was there, but in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 7, Israel wanted to have a what? A king. Now, true or false, Israel already at the time had a king. Absolutely. Who was their king? God. That's all God wanted. God was their king. They were His kingdom. But if you want to get literal and physically technical in a worldly sense, 1 Samuel 8 is where this begins, when they want to have this physical kingdom. Who was the first king of Israel? Saul. King Saul. And so they became, in a literal sense, a kingdom, having King Saul as their king. So it began, stage one of the kingdom in that sense, began there with Israel, the blank. The kingdom has three stages beginning with Israel. 1 Samuel 8 and verse 7. Now let's go to Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to turn to this one. Daniel chapter 2. And someone read verse 44. That's willing. Daniel 2 and verse 44.
And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.
Very good. Now, when he mentions that among these kings and these other kingdoms, what kingdoms is he referencing there in Daniel 2? Anyone remember? Do you remember the big image and the symbolism here in this chapter? The gold head and the silver body, and it talks about four kingdoms. What's that? Yes, absolutely. Starting with Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, and then we went to, what kingdom took over after Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians? Well, in time, in this particular account we're talking about here, literally, the Assyrians were a little bit later, but who conquered the Babylonians? The Persians, the Medes and Persian Empire, exactly. The Persians, remember Cyrus, Darius. And when you get to the end of the Persian reign, who took over what nation? The Greeks. Yeah, the Greeks were the third kingdom God's going to reference. The Greeks, Alexander the Great. And so the final kingdom, and arguably the greatest of biblical history, was that of who? Romans, the Roman kingdom. And so in that context, he says, while or during these other kingdoms, especially the last one, during the Roman kingdom, there's going to be a kingdom that's set up that will never be what? Destroyed. It will never be destroyed. And so in verse 44, we have a prophecy of this kingdom. And of course, that kingdom is the what? The church. The church. That is stage 2, if you will, of the kingdom then. The kingdom, the next stage there, letter I, the next stage was the church. The kingdom came before men blanked to whom Christ promised it in the first century. Let's look at Mark 9 and verse 1 and fill in the blank there. Mark 9 and verse 1. Matthew 3 and verse 2 that you see up there is John the Baptist preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But Mark 9 and verse 1 is where we want to go next. Someone read that one for us and let's fill in the blank. Now again, the mindset, the premillennial theory is that Jesus failed to set up the kingdom. So with that in mind, let's read Mark 9 and verse 1.
And he said to them, assuredly, I say to you, that there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power.
Very good. What goes in that blank? The kingdom came before the men blank to whom Christ promised it in the first century. Before they what? Died. Before they passed or died. Jesus told them, you will not taste of death until the kingdom comes. Right? I think we've mentioned this before. But if they believe that Christ failed to set up that kingdom, then you've got a major problem. If all these men died and they are dead, what does that mean Christ did right here in Mark 9 and verse 1? He lied. He deceived. He was wrong. He didn't fulfill His promise. And what would that therefore tell us about Jesus?
He is not who he says.
He's right. He's not who He says He is. We're wasting our time. He isn't God. He died on the cross and He was just a man and He can't save us from our sin. We know that's not the case. The other option, if the kingdom isn't here and He didn't lie, what does that say about these men that He just spoke to in the first century? They're still living and they're very old. They're very old. You guys here, some of you say that you feel old. You're not anywhere close to these guys. These guys are old, right? We know that's not the case. Jesus didn't fail to set up His kingdom. He did set it up. But that kingdom is the church. Some would argue that the church was a substitute, right? But that's certainly not the case. The kingdom is the church. Matthew 16 and verse 18, of course, Jesus promised that He would build His church. And in verse 19 He said, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom. Those words are interchangeable, as we've mentioned before. All right, number 3 there, Christians are in this kingdom blank. This is another reason, another argument that strongly disproves the concept that Jesus failed to set up the kingdom. Let's say they don't believe the church and the kingdom are the same. The kingdom is a different reference when He uses that word. Well, look at Colossians 1 and verse 13. Somebody read Colossians 1 and verse 13 and tell us what he says about the kingdom there.
He has delivered us from the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of the Son of His love.
Very good. Paul says that already, past tense, they have been translated into the what? The kingdom. In the first century, there were people who were already part of that kingdom. Christ didn't fail to set it up. It was already there. You might make a note there, or actually it's already there. Revelation 1 and verse 9, John, when he begins the writing there of Revelation, the visions, the signs that he's seeing, he talks about the fact that he is in the kingdom. He's already presently in it. What then would be the third stage of the kingdom? It began with Israel, then it became the church today, but the church is eternal, right? So what is the third stage of the kingdom? It's still the church, but what's going to happen to the church? Heaven. It's going to be delivered up. Who is currently in control? If you want to get technical, I realize it's the Godhead and they're all one. I realize that. But biblically speaking, who is currently the king or in charge of the kingdom? Christ. Christ is. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 24, tells us stage 3, and there's going to be a delivery, in a sense. Someone read that one for us. 1 Corinthians 15, 24.
And they come at the end when He shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father, put down all rules and all authority and power.
Excellent. The final stage, that eternal, it's going to last forever, is when Christ delivers the kingdom to who? To God the Father. To God the Father. And that, of course, will be in heaven forever. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 18, you see on the screen there is a reference. Paul says there that he is going to be in that heavenly kingdom. Heavenly kingdom. And that's a reference to that last stage. So the kingdom has always been. Christ didn't fail to set up that kingdom at all. The final stage of the kingdom is heaven. Christ did not fail to set up His kingdom on earth. All right? I went pretty quick through that. Is everybody with me so far? Any questions, concerns, missed blanks, anything like that? All right, very good. Let's keep going then. Let's talk about these signs. Right? Christ failed to set up the kingdom. Apparently, He's going to come back and set up a kingdom and reign for 1,000 years. Well, they believe that the Bible teaches that there are signs. And without exception, that I've ever, at least in my confrontations, studies, and discussions with people who believe in this, they always go to Matthew 24 to talk about these signs. And let's look at this with an open mind, because I understand very much so why they would think that this references signs. Matthew's account, in particular, is very difficult in the way it's worded in verse 3. It's interesting to me that it's worded this way at all. Matthew 24 and verse 3, we're talking about the signs of the second coming. In fact, the next blank, Matthew's account is a bit deceptive. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense of the word. Just the way this particular version is translated here is a little bit hard to understand. Matthew 24, let's just look. Don't pay attention to the context, yes, if you can help it. Look at verse 3 with me. And as, this is Jesus, He sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto Him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of Thy coming and of the end of the world? All right, when you read verse 3, it would be very fair to assume that Jesus is about to tell them about what? Yeah, the end of the world, the second coming, right? Judgment Day. And so what you read next in verses 4 and following, when He begins to talk about all of these things, they assume that these are signs referencing that second coming or the judgment. So we can kind of see. Have you ever heard people talk about, I remember when Hurricane Katrina came, I heard several say, this is a sign. This is God using the weather and nature. And could God use the weather in nature if He wants to in His providence? Sure. But is that a sign that the end is about to come? No. You see people all the time trying to name the date. I don't know how many times people have said, we figured it out. This is the date that it's going to end. We don't know when it is. But they believe that these are signs. And verse 3 does seem to give that idea. Let's be fair. But I want you to look at Luke 21 or Mark 13. Really, you can go to either one. Let's go to Luke 21 and verse 7. You can go to Mark 13:4. It'll be very similar. Here's how it's worded in Luke 21 and verse 7, a sister account to this. And this is the correct translation. I'll prove that to you in a moment. Verse 7, And they asked Him, saying, Master, here's the question based on Luke's account. When shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? No mention there about the end of the world or the second coming. The question literally that they're asking Jesus is, when is the things you just discussed going to happen? You just talked about something, and I want to know when those things will come to pass. Whatever it was that you just talked about. Right? So what do we need to do in order to know what the signs are, if you will, that Jesus is giving them? Reference. Yeah, let's see, find out what He talked about. Let's go back to Matthew, if you're not there already. Matthew chapter 23, the previous chapter. Look with me at verse 36. Matthew 23 and verse 36. All right, and by the way, the blank there, the question is about the previous statement Jesus had made. Let's flip that over to the back and look at Matthew 23 and verse 36. Jesus said this. This is what they're asking Him about. Verily, I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Look at the next two verses, if that's not clear enough. Jesus went out, departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for him to show the buildings of the temple. Here's what he says. See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now question. They asked him, Jesus, when will these things come to pass? What will be the signs that they're going to happen? What are they asking him about? What was the statement? Destruction of the temple. The destruction of Jerusalem. That's what we're talking about. Right? This is prior to when that happened. And what year was the temple destroyed? AD 70. Very good. AD 70. And so that is the context of this discussion. Jesus, the blank there, is discussing the destruction of the temple or Jerusalem based on Matthew 23. That's what they asked about. So now when we read what we're about to read, in that context, it's going to make a lot more sense. Look at verses 4 through 6. Just even more evidence. It's interesting to me, even if you did not know what Jesus was talking about, if you're reading Matthew's account, you didn't look at any others, and you just saw verse 3 and kept going, look at what he says next. Jesus said to them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. What's he basically telling them in short? You're going to hear about all these rumors, about all of these signs. Be not deceived, though. They're really not what? They're really not signs. That's really not it. That doesn't mean it's going to come. In fact, the end will be later. That doesn't, really, Jesus just tells them, that doesn't signify the end. But he does go on to give them some things that will happen prior to the destruction. And that is beginning there in verse 7 and on down. We won't take the time to read all of those. But that's the context. These references he makes are with regard to the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And look at verse 34 when he concludes his thoughts. And then he changes the subject, which we'll notice in a moment. But as he ends it, he says this, Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not what? Pass till all these things be fulfilled. Again, just like Mark 9 and verse 1, he says to them, this generation will not leave this world, will not die, until all of these things happen. Again, even if he was talking about the second coming, right? Or at least even if they think he is, nonetheless, I should say, verse 34 says they're not going to die until this happens. So once again, we've either got a lie or we've got some really old folks, because the second coming hasn't occurred yet. Even premillennialists agree with that. The second coming isn't going to come until the very end, until Judgment Day. At least the one we're talking about. I guess they would call it the third coming in their mindset. But nonetheless, verses 4 through 6, Jesus tells them plainly, if you're looking at your worksheet, that the rumors are not signs. Also, these people won't die or pass until these things happen, verse 34. Now, let's add one more thought to this before we run out of time. Two more keys in seeing this. Verses 15 and 16. Now, I want you to stay with me here, because this is a phrase that, you think about the books like Daniel and Revelation, and it can sometimes be scary and intimidating, and when you see phrases that come from those books, but if you just stay in the context and really kind of dive into it, it's really not as difficult as you might think, especially in this particular context. Look at verse 15. Let's notice what he says. When you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. All right, I want you to notice two things here that continue to disprove this idea of this referencing the second coming and these being signs of it. Verse 16, let's go in opposite order here. Verse 16 first. What stands out to you about his advice in verse 16, if this were referencing the second coming? You can't run from it.
Nowhere to go.
There's nowhere to go. Exactly. All right. Now, what is Judea a reference to? What's in Judea? Jerusalem, yeah. Judea is just the region, right? Jerusalem, the temple there. So he's literally just telling them, get out of Dodge, right? Get out of town, as we might say. Run to the mountains. Now, if this was the second coming, would running to the mountains do you any good? No. But if we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, could you be spared if you got out of town in time? Absolutely. So Jesus' advice, again, makes much more sense with that of the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, that's the next blank there. First, notice they are told to flee to the mountains. But then, verse 15, he mentions the abomination of desolation. All right, let's put your marker here in Matthew 24. We're going to come back to it, and let's go over to Daniel for just a moment. Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. Very prophetic language, figurative language, a lot of things going on in Daniel. And in fact, Lord willing, I would like to do a study in Daniel in the future if the Lord wills that to take place. But just in verse 31, we don't have time to talk about all the context here, but just read verse 31. And really, I don't think it will cause you to be too lost just reading this one passage. He says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary." This is a prophecy in reference to the destruction of the temple here in Jerusalem. "Therefore he shall be," verse 31, "shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." The abomination that maketh desolate. That's what he's referencing in Matthew, what he mentioned back here in Daniel. He says it again in another location previously as well. But notice in verse 31, he's going to take away the daily what? The daily sacrifice. What might that be a reference to? The temple. The destruction of the temple, right? That makes sense. It's not too complicated. But what in the world is this abomination of desolation? What do you think is going to get set up? What's going to happen that causes that temple to be destroyed in Jerusalem?
The Romans, they're going to put up Titus is going to want to profane it by putting up images in it.
You're exactly right. I mean, just verbatim. Nailed it. Look at, was that the veil? It was, wasn't it? Let's go over, we got 5 minutes. Luke 21. Let's go ahead and jump over to Luke. One of the great things about the Bible and the Gospels in particular is that you get these text and sister verses, as I sometimes call them, where writers will talk about some of the same things again. And some give you more details than others. And Carlos is exactly right. Luke chapter 21, he tells us what this is. This is not something we have to guess what it is. It's not something where we got to try to interpret it for ourselves. There are signs and symbols that we don't have given to us that make these books difficult. This is not one of them. Luke 21, verse number 20. Somebody read verse number 20 and tell us what he tells us that this abomination is. Luke 21:20.
"And when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh."
Very good. And this is a sister passage. If you look at verse 21, let them in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in them. It's the same thing, same context, exact same situation, but Luke's account of it. But he tells us what that desolation is. What is the abomination that will make desolate the temple? The what? There in verse 20. It'll be compassed about with armies. And historically, of course, we know that just like Carlos said, Titus certainly brought his armies. And the Romans did, in fact, desecrate. He set up his abominations, his idols. And so it makes very much sense as to why Jesus would say there is this abomination that will make desolate. You can flee to the mountains, but if you stick around, you're not going to have a very enjoyable time. So the abomination there is the Roman armies, the blank there, the Roman armies. All right, back to Matthew 24. Our time is almost up. Any questions or thoughts about that? All right, very good. Matthew 24, and the lesson is yours. We got maybe 1 minute. I just want you to jump down to verse 35 and notice this with me. Jesus does end up talking about the second coming. However, it's a subject change. Verse 35, Heaven and earth shall pass. This is Matthew 24:35. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Notice verse 36. But of that day and hour knoweth no man. There's no signs, there's no hints, there's no clues. Nobody knows about that day, right? The second coming. Knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. At this point in time, not even the Lord Himself knew when He was going to come again. Jesus did not even know. Only, not even the angels, only God the Father. And so finally, letter D there, Jesus changes the subject to the second coming in verse 36. But of that day knoweth no man. And He continues on to discuss Judgment Day. Notice that the coming of the day is known only by who? God. God the Father. You could put Father or God there. Very, very good. Next week we're going to pick up, I do want to get into the rapture. I don't know that we're going to talk about every detail of premillennialism, but the rapture is a big part of it. So we're going to do the rapture next week, at least, and maybe the Battle of Armageddon if we can get to it. So any last minute thoughts, questions, concerns before we conclude? All right. I think that's a good thing, maybe. Very good. Appreciate your good attention tonight. And if you'll stay with us a few more moments, we'll have a song and invitation before we're dismissed.